welcome to the Elizabeth and Irwin Warren Folk Art Symposium, Points of Interest, New Approaches to American Weathervanes. Thank you all so much for being here. We'll continue this afternoon with talks by Elizabeth Mcgoway, Olivia Armandoff, and William D. Moore before closing with closing remarks from our curatorial chair of the collections and curator of folk art, Emily Javault. As a quick reminder, closed captioning is available and can be activated by, I'm hearing no sound. Is anyone else having trouble with sound? If so, our IT director, Richard Ho, will let you know and can help with that. And I'm seeing that sound is good. So for anyone who's having trouble with sound, we recommend maybe checking your computer, but each talk today will be followed by Q&A. So we'll just follow the exact same format as earlier, and we invite you to share questions for our speakers throughout their talks. So far, these questions have been wonderful and really probing and helping us to explore more of this work. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Liz Mcgoway, and we see the schedule here. Dr. Liz Mcgoway is the Anne S. and Samuel M. Mankoff Associate Curator of Arts of the Americas at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she focuses on American decorative arts and design. She completed her BA in art history at the University of Wisconsin, and her MA and PhD in the history of art at Indiana University, with fellowships at the New York Public Library and the Smithsonian American Art Museum Renwick Gallery. She was also a fellow at the Winterthur Institute at the Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library. Liz is the editor and co-author of Silver in the Art Institute of Chicago, published in 2017, and she recently co-curated Photography and Folk Art, Looking for America in the 1930s in 2019, which we were very excited to hear about, and some of us at the museum were able to see. She recently worked on Landscape in Light, the Tiffany window at the Art Institute of Chicago, which marked the debut of the Hartwell Memorial Window, a monumental stained glass landscape designed by Agnes Northrup for Tiffany Studios. So we're so glad to have you here with us today, Liz, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here in dialogue with excellent colleagues and a fantastic virtual audience. I join you from Chicago, which is located on the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and many other tribes such as Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox also call this area home. My thanks foremost to Elizabeth and Irwin Warren for their support of this incredible program, to the American Folk Art Museum staff, especially Persephone and Richard. I echo how seamlessly you have done this. And congratulations too to everyone who worked on the exhibition and the fantastic catalog. Although I have only been able to experience it virtually, the scholarly depth and the dynamic installation really shines through. And it's been fantastic to be able to engage with this subject and the works even from afar. My title today, Winds of Change in the 1930s, Weathervanes, the Index of American Design and the Questioning of Artistic Canon Formation, hits on a number of things I've been thinking about really since I jumped into art history as an undergrad, when I was very taken with a course on American modernism, and still surfaces in my work every day. How, or more specifically, can we define American visual identity? What constitutes the canon of American art? At what point has this been challenged and expanded? And how do these works end up in museum collections? And why does that matter? The first weather vane of this talk is at the heart of the Art Institute of Chicago's collection, and it's one that intersects directly with these themes. I mentioned my gateway into art history was through American modernism, and thus, in many ways, my knowledge of and appreciation for weather vanes follows the trajectory of many in the early 20th century. And it's a story that you're all likely familiar with. Folk art, with weather vanes playing a starring role, comes to the fore through efforts of avant-garde artists championing, buying, exhibiting, and depicting these 18th and 19th century objects. This Peacock Weathervane entered the Art Institute's collection in 1952. It was a direct purchase from Edith Halpert, who you'll also hear about from me in this talk, as a prime example of vernacular American sculpture that had a universal appeal. It had just been featured in an exhibition, Masterpieces of American Folk Art. And our incoming records of the object describe it as, quote, a remarkable vane from a farmhouse in Westchester, Pennsylvania. In its simplified design and balance of forms, it's closely allied with the current direction in modern sculpture, end quote. It quickly went on view at the museum as part of a larger folk art exhibition, which was the first of its kind at the Art Institute. And the museum's bulletin declared at the time, quote, our recognition of the value of American folk art has been brought about by the great changes in aesthetic attitudes which have taken place in the 20th century. Among the first to attract the visitors' attentions are the Weathervanes, end quote. And as you can see from this installation image, the peacock was not the only Weathervanes signaling this expansion of the canon of American art to include folk art within the context of this encyclopedic museum, and we weren't alone. But birds, horses, fish soared over a gallery of objects that reflected this embrace of old, new aesthetics, forms, and materials. Now, while I won't dwell here, I would really be remiss in not mentioning the kind of pre-1930s embrace of American folk art, and particularly the pivotal role that the man pictured here, Hamilton Easterfield, played in a lot of the developments that I'm discussing today, those that brought the Peacock Weathervane into a museum collection. Field was an artist, a critic, a dealer, a patron, a teacher. He was passionate about modern art and the material culture of America's past, and established an art school in Algonquin, Maine, a fishing village north of Boston. Although his student enrollment was modest, many artists who shaped modern art in America either studied or passed through this idyllic arts colony that he established. And I'm showing you here just some of these works, from the fluid and whimsical sculptures of Ellie Knottleman to Marguerite Zorach's extraordinary looped fabric pictorial textiles, and Robert Laurent's abstracted sculptures of the natural world. In his teaching and encouragement of artistic practice, Field did not reinforce a hierarchy of materials. To him, art was instinctual and expression could take many forms. He wrote, quote, art, even decorative art, is the expression of the soul of a people, end quote. And it was really from him that many modernists developed folk art fever. Yasuo Kuniyoshi, who was a close artist close with Field. Field was his first patron, and Kuniyoshi spent a lot of summers in Okonkwo. He captures this material interest in this painting, Weathervane and Objects on a Sofa. And Kuniyoshi, like many in Field's circle, collected early American works, furnished his homes with them, and took them as his subject, like this painting, where this, amazing silhouetted horse Weathervane is astride the settee. Other early 20th century artists like Arthur Dove, who were further outside of Field's circle, but also deeply invested in the development of a distinct American modernism, found inspiration in the Weathervanes that were dotted along the American landscape. And here he captures this arrow Weathervane not as a static work of sculpture, but the kinetic object it was intended to be, moving in the winds of his abstracted scene. While American avant-garde artists mined this part of America's past, literally and figuratively, it was the Index of American Design that codified the nation's early material culture as an art historical reference. In the 1930s, as the United States struggled through the Great Depression, economic instability inspired these calls for a national unity that found expression in the art world. Artists, curators, collectors, and government administrators attempted to define a distinctly American visual identity. They, like the modern artists we've seen, gravitated to American vernacular arts, which they called folk art. And broadly speaking, this vast array of objects from early America, they started to locate this national aesthetic that they considered egalitarian, unpretentious, self-made, and importantly, distinct from Euro traditions. From 1935 until 1952, The Index of American Design sought to define a collective spirit of the US through the handcrafts of its past. And you can kind of see the index at work here. This was a government-sponsored project. The index employed artists to visually catalog objects of the type that you can see here. And over these years, it was under the Works Progress Administration that they sought to define this collective spirit through handcraft. It was just one of many programs that were formed under the Works Progress Administration, which really was a sweeping government initiative employing millions of Americans to improve the nation's infrastructure. And the artist in particular employed artists to produce these watercolor illustrations of American decorative arts and crafts, particularly those, quote, having special character which distinctly marks them as of American origin, end quote. The index was initiated by artist and librarian Ramona Javits at left and the textile designer Ruth Reeves to her right. Won over, Constance Rourke served as editor, and it was a project that was overseen by curator and head administrator of the WPA's Federal Art Project, Holger Cahill, on the right. Under their guidance, approximately 400 artists produced over 18,000 renderings of American folk arts from the colonial period to the 1800s. And the objects were found in public institutions, local museums, private holdings from 34 different states and various regions across the country. And besides supplying employment for the artists, the index really had two primary goals: to uncover and recognize a distinctly American cultural heritage based in this kind of rich and abundant tradition that they located in folk art, and to assemble a visual vocabulary for the future development of American design. I moved ahead in a slide, but I'll kind of finish that thought by saying Constance Rourke, who was one of these key players, as part of the index, she asserted, quote, "If this work is to be carried out to full completion, the questions, what is American design, or have we an American design, may answer themselves, possibly with some surprises, and certainly with a wealth of fresh materials." And now you can see how people were able to see the fruits of all of this labor and this like close looking at these objects, because the index watercolors really went on a grand tour of the United States. It went from museums to art centers, even department stores, like this image of the index installed at R.H. Macy & Co. And now it's a vast visual archive at the National Gallery of Art, which remains one of the largest record of everyday objects from early America. The notion that weather vanes were quintessential artistic expressions of the American spirit was reinforced through their inclusion as a type in the Index of American Design. And here you can see an artist working on a rendering of a running horse weather vane. And here another of the sense of the range of the weather vanes captured by the index. Holger Cahill had already worked to define weather vanes as sculpture in his role as curator and champion of folk art in the early 1930s. This is before he even took on his role for the WPA. And he included them in many of the earliest exhibitions of folk art in America. And the language around them, emphasizing sturdiness and freedom and vitality, no doubt made them ideal emblems of the nation's vibrant creativity being captured by index artists. And here is the original Archangel Gabriel Weathervane with its corresponding index rendering. And I really can't help but put this one up large. I could look at this all day. This is a demonstration drawing used to teach the meticulous methods of making renderings to other artists. And the dialogue across media within the index is so fascinating. I mean, it's something that I think many of us are interested in as people who study material culture. And for instance, when I look at Cabo's careful attention to capturing the irregularities of this weathered surface in pencil and thin layers of paint, my mind always draws a parallel to our contemporary scrutinization and judgment of the age and authenticity and quality of Weathervane patinas. Figures like the Archangel Gabriel made up just a portion of the tremendous range of Weathervane subjects, and I mean that very broadly. Human subjects were often allegorical, like the famed Weathervane at left, and also as in action as agents in the development of technology, like those on the Harris and Company steam fire engine Weathervane. But for a moment, it's the figures like those on the right of a Native American figure with a bow and arrow that I want to focus on in the context of the Index of American Design, because such stereotypes of Native people were used as symbols of national heritage. Turning back to the organization and the goals of the index, these attempts to define the United States broadly through its visual and material culture ended up being quite rigid in many ways. And there was a lot of gatekeeping around whose and what kinds of work were included, and it marginalized many makers, especially Native artists. It's important to note that Native arts were excluded from the index in the name of keeping the project manageable, but also due to internal prejudices against such works as ethnographic and thus covered elsewhere. But despite this, stereotypical depictions of Native Americans, particularly constructions of the human body, were deployed as emblems of the democratic and pluralistic national identity the index asserted. They were lifted up as particularly American subjects to promote the project, as you can see here in these posters. These are the types of posters that were in circulation publicly. The one on the left featuring Shem Drown's, or pardon me, on the right, Shem Drown's Weathervane of the Native American archer for the Province House in Boston from 1716, which is the earliest known weathervane by America's earliest documented weathervane maker. And here we're looking at the original drowned weathervane in the index rendering. And that the stereotype and the myth of the Native American as a single entity dressed in feathers with a bow and arrow, that this is serving as this through line from America's past to this contemporary, a 1930s contemporary effort to define national identity in the 1930s really demands critique. And I mean, Catherine Fine's talk earlier today is one example of this, but especially in the 1930s, this time of reimagining federal Indian policies and legislation under Roosevelt's New Deal, where there was a repealing of the Dawes Act and the end of allotment and efforts to support self-government among tribes, although many of these changes were not realized and were seen by Native communities as progress imposed upon them. I do think it's important to note this kind of difference in tenor between the visual representation of Native people and attention to their lived experience in the 1930s, and it's very stark. One of the consulting contributors, scholar Joseph Zorden for the exhibition, eloquently wrote, quote, "These weathervanes and images like it were meant to produce an ornamental indigeneity," end quote. And, you know, just to carry this through, and for those of you that want to think more about this, I really encourage you to watch the recent American Folk Art Museum's program, Entangled Images, Perspectives on Indigenous Representation. Now, while the Index of American Design was a critical project in the development of an expanded artistic canon, this change was driven by a constellation of people, some invested in the index, some kind of adjacent to it. And at the forefront of these efforts as well was gallerist Edith Halpert, shown here in a photograph on the left and a fantastic painting of her in her downtown gallery on the right. Halpert had established herself as a modern art dealer in 1926 when she opened a gallery dedicated to contemporary American artists. And in 1931, with Holger Cahill, opens the American Folk Art Gallery in New York. And this was the first commercial gallery dedicated entirely to this material, located in the downtown gallery, focusing on modern art. And you can see this kind of dual space in this image with the two names side by side in the window. I couldn't help but pull out this detail of the leaping stag weathervane under the American Folk Art name. Halpert was a savvy marketer, and she kept a really quick pace of exhibitions and new artists in her spaces. So at left, you can see her inaugural exhibition at the Downtown Gallery. You might see some of these familiar faces from earlier, Marguerite Zorak on the wall and a figure by Knottleman on the chest. And at right is Halpert's 1937 installation, American Folk Art Sculpture, the Index of American Design, Federal Art Project, which featured watercolors of the index alongside folk art objects from her own inventory, really, again, connecting the index as an art historical reference to now this kind of new market for these objects, or what she's continuing to trying to create a market for these objects. And she really excelled at marketing these to individual and institutional collectors. As she later attested, quote, "A lot of other people got there before me. I did not invent folk art," end quote. But she did remove it from the context of antiques and start to emphasize its potential to inspire contemporary artists. Weathervanes were, there we go, and advancing. Weathervanes were a popular offering at the Folk Art Gallery. Halpert began to collect them in the 1920s on road trips through the Northeast, stopping to barter with owners and remove them from rooftops. In her own words, quote, "I carried slacks with me and I'd climb into all sorts of dirty joints," end quote. Time magazine reported that she was, quote, "busily stripping the New England skyline of more than 100 vanes for sales to collectors and museums," end quote. And here's some more of the ways that Halpert starts to shift this approach to display, really pulling these objects, as you know, she quotes quite like literally from the works, and placing them on pedestals, elevating them as static sculptural objects. So this kind of brings us back full circle to the Art Institute's Peacock, which was in fact one of a group of 8 that entered the collection of the Art Institute in 1952. And I show it with some of the others here. Not all stayed in the collection. The wooden seagull, for instance, which I think is very interesting given some of the material conversations that we've had today. But certainly the peacock stands out for the aesthetics that continue to resonate with contemporary audiences. Reasons that Halpert saw and really have continued to inform folk art's place in the canon of American art. This simplification of shape, dynamic form, but also the way in which people talk about the intangibles, an expression of freedom, of vitality, of creativity in these types of silhouettes. It's a work that can move into different contexts, particularly the art institutes, where our collecting histories of folk art and of modern art are very much entwined. It's a work that I love to revisit. I loved doing this here in relation to the Folk Art Museum's exhibition, but certainly we're also doing this in the context of rethinking the collection, rethinking our teaching of American art history. And on that note, I wanted to end here then with this Weathervane's immediate future, soon to be reinstalled in our galleries of modern American art alongside a work by Kuniyoshi, which was also purchased directly from Edith Halpert. But in thinking about this idea of the canon formation and teaching and display and these relationships, I know this is not going to be the Peacock's last home here or potentially in other contexts, because our consideration of Weathervanes in the canon of American art continues. And this is just one case study investigation of that. Thank you so much. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Liz. It's wonderful to get this sort of sneak peek into the Peacock's future and to see that juxtaposition of it being integrated with contemporary pieces of fine art. We have to start off our Q&A, and for everyone on the call, we invite you to submit questions. We have a question that comes to us from Emily that came to us halfway through that wonderful talk. She writes, "I've been struck by the exquisite realism of the index drawings." I think I shared that too. And also how beautifully stylistically aligned the drawings are with one another. Are you aware of any documentation around how the artists may have collaborated to agree upon a unifying style for the project?
Not the artist. I mean, this was like clearly defined, I think really by the orchestrators of the index. And as a catalog, there was an attention to the idea of verisimilitude and realism right from the start. And that's where you have things coming in like the Gabriel technical drawing. It's not the only technical drawing that was used as a teaching tool for other artists. So there was a consistency there, but when you think about 400 artists participating in this, it's also, I think it is really striking just how much they must have been driven to do this and how much that expectation was there to have come upon something that does feel so unified. I mean, you saw, I tried to put a slide up that just showed a little bit of like this variety. And, you know, it's not all alike. And certainly if you spend time with the watercolors themselves or with the publications where some of these are illustrated, like you can start to see different artists' hands and look at it. But yeah, I think it was an expectation. And I don't know enough about the stages of, you know, when these were being submitted, like what that vetting process was. I think that is, I mean, Persephone, to what you said before, like all of the ways that there's still so much to uncover. Like, you know, as part of this talk, I didn't get to go do the on-site research I maybe would have liked to, but I was really curious, for instance, if anyone had actually done like why am I losing my words here, but like a quantifiable study of the index. Like, in other words, how many of them are weather vanes? And within that, I was really interested again in this depiction of the human body and how that might have played into the distinction. So I think there's really a lot of work to be done on the index. And when you get into the art history of it, there's so many amazing scholars will to come who have done like phenomenal work on it, but none of us should consider it the end, certainly.
Thank you. Well, it's generating a lot of questions, and one that this is actually something that I wondered about too, and I assume this has to do with the WPA aspect of the project. Renee writes, "Why were handmade renderings used in the Index of American Design instead of photographs? Was there some affinity between handmade records and handmade objects? Who were the people making those renderings? Were they the artists themselves?" I think this gets to the question around speaking to the artists who are making the watercolors for the index.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that question is that it was a work project. It was intended to be a source of income for artists. So in that sense of like not defining it merely as a photographic project was because of creating this expanded work opportunity for artists. But there were photographs associated with it. People were out photographing spaces. They were, you know, was it Laura? I'm so sorry, I'm blanking, but somebody actually referenced this idea of, you know, having to use notes and images to create these renderings. So some of the artists were able to work directly from the objects, like you saw in some of the photographs I showed, but there wasn't a one size fits all to this approach. And it was also regionally divided. So people were like out seeking and finding these works that were then being kind of assigned to different artists for them to work. So it really was a massive collaborative project of discovery and artistic process.
Thank you. I want to just also, I see that Emily is writing a response to this, but in case anyone else was wondering, the peacock that you've showed is at the Art Institute. It was not in our exhibition. And the talks for the second, no, that's on us. The talks for the second session are really bringing us expanding upon the exhibition in a way. I really see this second session as moving us sort of beyond our show. So another question related to the index. Laura writes, "I've noticed that the index very rarely, if ever, references the place or site for its objects." So question of provenance. Why do you think that it is, especially given the project's nationalistic undertones and regional division of artists?
I think in many ways it was this idea of isolating these objects as this kind of creative inspiration for the development of American design. So when you do that, when you take it out of its context and you make it about color, you make it about form, you make it about shape, it became a kind of different visual index than just a history or recording of what's there. So it was really a twofold project. I mean, there are records of what these objects are, right? None of that is a mystery, you can find it. But in terms of the watercolors themselves, I do think there was an intention for these to be some kind of like universal approach to the visual culture around us, and being able to kind of look at the object isolated, right? Which is a kind of a modernist lens, like even in its execution. So I think it's all part of this moment and of these intertwined histories.
That's wonderful. And I see that we also, Will's also written that the original papers of the index record who owns the work when it was recorded. So that sort of evolution of the earlier, the first iterations, and then as the project evolves, and how they become somewhat divorced.
Thank you.
When the economy improved, this is another question, and artists were no longer hired to compile the index, was the project abandoned? Could you speak to the end of the project in the 50s?
At the end of the project, it was already circulating. So in terms of being abandoned, not so much, it was still like moving throughout the country. But it ended up being a project that ended, right? And there was a lot of ways that there was an investment in what it could be. I mean, here in Chicago, for instance, the art community that emerged from this, and the South Side arts community was a huge blossoming and something that continued on. So I think in terms of the WPA projects themselves, there was a future looking, and everyone hoped that this was going to be an investment that continued. The index itself, though, did become a closed and kind of a static project, but then housed and these records kept. And it's interesting to me, like, I don't think of it as something that kind of went into obscurity, but I think for many, they see it that way, right? That, I spent a little time with Holder Cahill's interview in the Archives of American Art for this talk. And I mean, even then he had reason to try to say how important this was, and that people might not see it as something that was transformative, but it was. So I've gone far afield from the question, but I hope that is of interest and gets at the heart of it.
And another question. Is this
I'm like
seeing in the chat?
To follow it too, but I just saw briefly a call out to Kay Wells's talk at AHA, and really, like, she was talking about the index in terms of digital art history and these things. So yes, there's really good work happening. Absolutely, thanks for that reference.
Yeah, and bringing us sort of into how record keeping and indexing is, it's not just an index of the objects, but it's an index of how people were thinking about records and record keeping and archives at that time. One question was, with the index and those images, were the images themselves ever editioned so that they could be acquired individually by museums or collectors, or, looking at the Halpert installation photos where you have maybe reproductions on the wall?
That is a great question, and I cannot speak with authority on it. I am not, to my knowledge, I've never seen any kind of prints in circulation. You see these posters, right? So you see the watercolors reproduced as part of a broader broadcast of the index. But if anyone else has information on that, I invite you to contribute, but I don't know.
Well, thank you. This was just a really wonderful talk, Liz. And I see that we have one, another question that just came in, and we'll use this as our final talk. I think this is a very big question. They asked, did the project become the inspiration for American modern art?
I don't think it became, my answer would be no. And it's for some of the things that I talked about in this talk, but it's hard to like follow these timelines and trajectories, right? Like, there was a lot of interest, effort, investment in this that predated the Index of American Design. But the index was a huge like visual archive and cataloging and like investment in making this available and circulating, and really having people who weren't practicing artists also kind of have their eyes opened, right? That was this intention, like you saw it at the department store, the ways that this is moving through a lot of urban, but also like smaller and rural communities. So I think it's a huge part of it. I think it had a really large impact, but I don't think that was what inspired modern art.
Well, I think that we'll be picking up on some of these threads in Will Moore's talk at the end of the session. So this is a really generative place to close and to go to our next speaker. And thank you so much again, Liz, for this beautiful talk. Olivia Armandoff, it's my pleasure to introduce, is a PhD student in the Department of Art History at the University of Southern California, where she works on early to mid 20th century American art with research interests that include the proliferation of imagery through printed materials, instances of collaborative production, the subversion and renegotiation of social boundaries through visual media, and questions of space and environment. She holds a BA from Yale University in the history of art and history, and she earned her MA in American Material Culture from the Winterthur program. She has worked on exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, National Gallery of Art, Yale University Art Gallery, Sterling Memorial Library, Delaware Art Museum, Blanton, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and American Swedish Historical Museum. We're thrilled to have her here. She's also published in Winterthur Portfolio, Journal of Design History, the Italian Modern Art Journal, and Women's Art Journal. And today we'll be hearing from Olivia about Isamu Noguchi. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Persephone. All right. I would like to start by thanking my fellow speakers who I've learned so much from today, as well as those who have made this conference possible, especially Persephone, whose expert organizational efforts were very much appreciated, and Richard for his technical support. I also want to thank Robert Shaw for his insightful curatorial work that's brought us all here today to talk about Weathervanes. I do want to acknowledge so much the Isamu Noguchi Foundation and Garden Museum, specifically Alex Ross, the editor of Noguchi's Catalogue Raisonné, who was incredibly generous with his time with me. And finally, I want to say how appreciative I am to everyone in the audience here with me today. Thank you for giving me your time and ears for the next 20 minutes. I do want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from Austin, Texas, which is the traditional homeland of many indigenous people, including the Apache, the Alabama Coushatta, the Kickapoo tribe, the Isleta Pueblo, the Lipan Apache, and the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians, as well as the Coatl Today, I'm going to be presenting this paper, Isamu Noguchi's Weathervanes, An Artist Animates the Wind. It may be rare to see a weathervane posed in situ today, but when we do, it is often a nostalgic reference. In the 1930s, though, for the artist Isamu Noguchi, a weathervane's historical legacy held important symbolic value for the modern world. Noguchi embarked upon a series of designs for weathervanes early in his career, and these designs illustrate the many ways that the artist balanced an investment in history and modernity, in figuration and abstraction, in the aesthetic and the functional, and in nature and the industrial. Today, Noguchi may best be known for his marble sculptures that are suggestive of his training in the studio of Constantine Brancusi in 1927, such as Koros, which stood at the entrance of the recent exhibition Making the Met. Or you might be familiar with his design work, such as his Akari lamps and his three-legged rudder or fin coffee tables, which continue to be manufactured today. But I'm guessing that few here are aware of Noguchi's sculpted weathervanes. Noguchi designed these weathervanes decades before his more iconic objects. And here already in 1933, we can see how he was exhibiting the highly experimental, creative approach that would define his later career. These weathervanes are somewhat of a mystery. What survives in the Noguchi archive today are photographs of 2 casts and a set of 3 drawings, as well as several preparatory sketches. While the actual models have been misplaced or destroyed with the passage of time, they remained in the artist's collection for several decades after they were created, and photographs of his studio in the mid-1940s, as well as an inventory for 1966, demonstrate this. Noguchi's commitment to preserving these weather vanes as models suggests he understood them to be an important part of his oeuvre, and it is likely only because of their fugitive materiality that they are lost to us today. In this talk, I'm hoping to unravel the role these weather vanes played in Noguchi's career, examining both the way they evoked American identity and the nation's investment in industrialization, but also symbolized the relationship between humans and the natural environment. Designed in the early 1930s, these weather vanes can be understood in the context of the larger revival of an interest in folk art. As we've just heard from Liz, the American Folk Art Gallery, founded in 1931 by Edith Halpert and Holger Cahill, played an important role in connecting New York modernists to objects such as weather vanes, and at the time, Noguchi and Cahill were close friends. Amy Lyford's important study of Noguchi's work from the 1930s to the 1950s takes into account Noguchi's contemporaneous projects, which were also concerned with American identity, including early figures of American history. Beginning in 1933, Noguchi embarked on a series of visionary projects, the first being Monument to the Plow. Noguchi envisioned a monumental pyramid earthwork, which would resemble those constructed by pre-Columbian mound-building cultures, which was to be crowned by the sculpture of a plow. Here is a model for this project from the bird's eye perspective. Noguchi had learned from his mentor how Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson corresponded about perfecting the steel plow's design, leading to an invention that ostensibly made the openings of the Western Plains possible. While Noguchi's Monument to the Plow was never realized, his other 1933 effort to honor Benjamin Franklin with a sculpture evoking a lightning rod was eventually made a reality half a century later. Noguchi would later compare his work on the weather vanes to these unrealized monuments, saying the weather vanes similarly remained a dream or concept. In his autobiographical piece, A Sense of Place, Noguchi describes the challenges the weather vane production was up against, asking, quote, "But where was the roof to put it on? Or who would hammer out and solder the thin metal? The idea was more appealing than anything that might be realized. Would the poetry have survived?" End quote. Furthermore, Noguchi's drawings of the weather vanes atop roofs suggest that he might have intended them to take on a monumental scale. They loom large, calling attention to themselves. This experimentation with scale is similarly suggested by the photos of weather vane models in Noguchi's studio. Here, Noguchi placed the model on a base that resembles a pitched roof, which is also dwarfed by the weather vane. Understood in the context of these other monument designs made in the same year, the weather vanes might have served as a means of exploring what visual icons were distinctly American and could evoke the nation and its history symbolically. Lyford uses Monument to the Plow, among other projects, to counter the dominant narrative in Noguchi scholarship that prioritizes biographical questions and his Japanese heritage, understanding his work through an essentializing, racialized lens. This scholarship draws upon the precedent of contemporaneous criticism, which first identified Noguchi through Orientalist notions, and after World War II, through the notions of hybridity and mixed race identity. Instead, Lyford establishes how Noguchi self-identified as an American. According to Lyford, Noguchi's work from the 1930s has been neglected in the art historical record because it does not easily relate to Japan. But instead, by revisiting his weather vane design today, we can see the ways Noguchi was thinking very deeply about American history. Noguchi had been interested in American history long before the 1930s. In fact, as Lyford discusses, and Deborah Goldberg handles extensively in her dissertation of Noguchi's early years as an artist, he was profoundly influenced by the ideas of his mentor, the physician, newspaperman, educator, and inventor, Edward Roomley. At 13, Noguchi had left his home in Japan to attend Roomley's progressive boarding school, Interlochen, in Rolling Prairie, Indiana. Rumley's curriculum was designed for the sons of industrialists, such as Henry Ford, and it promoted an entrepreneurial and inventive spirit that Noguchi resonated with. There, students not only toured factory spaces, but also embarked on design projects, such as self-sufficiently producing their own furniture and lab equipment, according to the ideals of the arts and crafts movement. Rumley developed a close relationship with Noguchi, embracing him as a member of his household, and he remained a key promoter of the artist's work after Noguchi graduated and embarked upon a career as a sculptor. As a teenager, Noguchi adopted Rumley's Tayloristic efficiency principles, and in later interviews, he credited Rumley for his idea that to be an American was to be an inventor. With his weathervane designs, Noguchi decidedly took on the role of the inventor, demonstrating his skill beyond the realm of art and business marketing and strategies. In 1929, Noguchi began his lifelong friendship with Buckminster Fuller, and by 1932 and 1933, he was also collaborating with Fuller, producing models and promoting the Dymaxion car, even going so far as to exhibit the Dymaxion bathroom in the courtyard of his studio. Only a few years later, in 1937, Noguchi would design his first industrially produced product, the baby monitor known as Radio Nurse. While this later project was realized under the sponsorship of the Zenith Radio Corporation, 5 years earlier, with his weathervanes, Noguchi had envisioned manufacturing and purveying his designs work under his own name with a venture he referred to as Time Design. In a prospectus for the potential firm Noguchi sent to Rumley in 1932, he envisions a business that would both design and manufacture common house goods, such as plates, lighting fixtures, furniture, and most importantly for us, weathervanes. This interest in fixtures intended for the domestic space is connected with Noguchi's simultaneous involvement with Fuller and the Dymaxion house. He emphasized the novel use of materials, including glass, stainless steel, and aluminum, and his weathervanes were intended ultimately to be produced not by plaster or magnesite, as these models were, but metal. The industrial materials would have allowed for inexpensive products, upholding the American value of democratic egalitarianism that Noguchi was invested in. Undertaken in the midst of the Great Depression, at a time when Noguchi associated himself with leftist politics and was involved with the Artists Union and actively promoted workers' rights and cooperative initiatives, this affordability was key. The inclusion of weathervanes in this business demonstrates how Noguchi intended his objects to be appealing to the average American citizen. His sketches show how he positioned weathervanes on traditional pitched roofs and imagined them suited for the typical American home or even barn. Noguchi sought not only to modernize the weathervane through its mechanized production and industrial materiality, he also experimented with how the weathervane might incorporate the still new technology of electricity. As Noguchi's 1933 Monument to Ben Franklin demonstrates, the sculptor was preoccupied with electricity long before he began to design Akari lamps in 1951. During his first experiences as an art student at the Leonardo da Vinci Art School in New York City in the 1920s, Noguchi's teacher, Honorio Rutuolo, idolized Thomas Edison and offered a course in electricity. In his 1986 essay, What is Sculpture?, Noguchi credited the origins of Akari lamps to 1933, when he worked on what he referred to as a luminous and musical weathervane. Noguchi's interest in the luminous surfaces of his sculptures can be traced back to his work in Brancusi's studio, where he was responsible for electric polishers on the sculpture's surfaces so that they retained a sheen that resembled a machine-made aesthetic. Noguchi's experimentation with metal in his own artistic work, including sculptural busts, shows how invested he was in the question of reflectivity. At the time, the problem of lighting his studio was of paramount importance. Inspired by Fuller's design for Romani Marier's Greenwich Village Tavern, Noguchi painted his studio with aluminum paint. And in 1932, Noguchi was also creating diagrams that envisioned the ideal use of both stationary and moving lenses, angled reflectors, and electric lighting to best illuminate sculpture displays. Later, after his weathervanes, he conceived of lunars, which were equipped with electrical elements so that light came from within the sculpture as well. These weathervanes are the origins of these lunar projects. Like the lunars, one weather vane was made of timstone, a type of magnesite or cement-like material that Fuller had brought to Noguchi's attention. Noguchi described timstone as the ideal reflecting material, especially given its smooth surface sheen. A surviving photograph in color allows us to imagine how these illuminated weather vanes might have appeared. While the lunar sculptures were intended for interiors, the weather vanes would have been positioned out of doors and on the roofs of houses, so their luminosity might have evoked the glow of a celestial object, such as a moon, as their name, lunar weather vanes, implies. While Noguchi's weather vanes are undeniably associated with industry in their planned production methods and their materiality, they are also closely connected to nature. Throughout his life, Noguchi was fascinated by the environment, something undoubtedly shaped by his youth in Japan. Growing up, his mother allowed him to cultivate his own garden, and he recalled how she imagined a future for him as a forester, impetus he directly cites for his weather vane designs. The art of Zen gardening influenced his larger work, and he would later produce garden designs professionally, considering himself a gardener. Both Noguchi's contemporaneous monument designs, such as Monument to the Plow, and his subsequent playground and park designs also reflect an interest in shaping a total immersive environment. Noguchi broadly conceived of the notion of media, and he not only created sculptures out of more modern manufactured materials like concrete, timstone, and aluminum. His work in stone was in the tradition of direct carving and sometimes done outdoors so as to understand the material in its natural environment. As Monument to the Plow demonstrates, Noguchi realized the potential of the earth to be sculpted decades before earthworks became a form of modern sculpture. And he also understood water as medium, as with his fountain designs, such as his work for Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan. Much of Noguchi's relationship with nature had to do with wind, including his earlier projects, such as a 1928 sculpture that experimented with the form of the sail. While Noguchi was forced to leave this object in Paris after he moved on from his time in Brancusi's studio, he later recreated it in 1962, demonstrating its importance. And the subject of wind would remain an inspiration, as titles for his later sculptures show, including his 1959 aluminum Wind, his ground winds from the later 1960s, and his wind catcher from 1982. Finally, Noguchi was a kite enthusiast, beginning when he was enrolled in Roomley School, and many of his kite designs influenced his sculpture work. We might even think of Noguchi's interest in the wind extending to the air as a means through which radio waves were transmitted in his aforementioned baby monitor, Radio Nurse. The investment in the elements, from vegetal growth to water and wind, shows how Noguchi conceived of nature as a strong, vital force. Most importantly, Noguchi saw these natural elements as closely interconnected. For example, for his unrealized 1974 design for the Friendship Fountain in the middle of the Missouri River in Omaha, Noguchi explicitly connected water to wind, conceiving of a windmill that would circulate the water through the 160-foot tall structure. In an interview, when discussing the Omaha design, he spoke of, quote, the Great Plains and the use of windmills to draw up water as part of American history. Here, the wind permitted the use of water and thus life, allowing for the country's continued growth. Noguchi's weather vanes enact this dynamism. Like all other weather vanes, they were intended to move at the impetus of the wind. In order to achieve the ideal range of movement, Noguchi designed these weather vanes with what he described as louvers that allowed the wind to rush through their core. The louvers have much in common with the features in the natural world, such as fish's gills and fins, which counteract friction and facilitate speedy movement. Furthermore, Noguchi drew upon the principles of streamlined design that he was working on at the same time with Fuller. In many ways, the shape of one weather vane closely resembles that of a teardrop, inspiration for the Dymaxion car with its smooth, rounded edges and long, narrow tail. According to the streamlined principles, the weather vane would have easily moved and enacted his function. At the same time as the weather vane embraces the wind, it was also designed to obstruct it. Noguchi's most famous work from this era is known as Miss Expanding Universe, and it has much in common aesthetically with the weather vane. Produced in 1932, this sculpture was intended to hang from the ceiling in a suspended state. and the figure's stretched skirt appears to act almost like a parachute, keeping it afloat. The sculpture is connected to Noguchi's work that year on attire known as costume sacks for Ruth Page's dance performances, which similarly thwart movement. This tension between an embrace and a rejection of the wind suggests a teasing approach that is in keeping with Noguchi's long-term interest in play. Most importantly, Noguchi enlivened the wind by endowing it with noise. He not only referred to his weathervanes as lunar weathervanes, but also as musical weathervanes. In their design, he was inspired by an experience he had in Peking, now known as Beijing, when he traveled around the world in 1930. There, he remembered hearing what he called a wooing noise made by pigeons flying with hollowed out gourds tied to them. We can imagine what Noguchi might have heard thanks to a recording from the Pitt Rivers Museum's 2016 composer in residence, Nathaniel Mann, who was inspired by these traditional Chinese pigeon whistles. And so I'm going to play this clip right now. Oops. It is not surprising that Noguchi was interested in these birds. One of Noguchi's earliest sculptures, made in 1924, before he embraced abstraction, was titled The Raven, after Edgar Allan Poe's poem. His time in Peking came on the heels of his training with Brancusi, who was well known for creating his sculptures of birds, including his Bird in Space series that was ongoing when Noguchi was an apprentice. And later on, Noguchi would continue to evidence his interest in birds in sculptures such as his 1958 work, Pregnant Bird, which recalls Brancusi's precedent. Other sculptures explicitly acknowledge birds' musicality, such as Birdsong, also from 1958. For the Weathervanes, Noguchi sought out Rumley's advice in his attempts to recreate the sonic quality of the gourds, which he compared to the sound of an Aeolian harp. In order to help him perfect the resonance of the Weathervane, Rumley connected Noguchi to Otto Ziegler, a specialist in combustion instruments. Ziegler, in turn, advised Noguchi the sound could be created by stretching strings of at least 18 inches across a funnel-shaped cross-section. Noguchi remained concerned with the simulation of natural sounds. Later in his career, in the aforementioned Osaka fountain, Noguchi sought to recreate the sonic qualities of a conch shell, something he explicitly connected in an interview to the sound of the wind. Noguchi's investment in the auditory qualities of his weathervanes demonstrates his interest in senses and perception beyond vision and his work to recreate an entire experience that holistically captured the natural environment. Associated with both the domestic goods of time design and with lighting design, these weathervanes are an early example of Noguchi's investment in technology and the modern domestic space. But they are also a reflection of his fascination with the natural world. Instead of thinking of these as dichotomous interests, pitting America's pastoral ideal against a burgeoning industrial economy, as Leo Marx did in The Machine in the Garden, we have to remember that by the 1930s, other designers were equally interested with integrating technology and nature. Brancusi himself compared birds to propellers. Fuller drew upon nature for his streamlined designs, and most influentially, the well-regarded French architect Le Corbusier saw a connection between nature and machinery, seeking to design a house that would be a machine for living. We might consider this weathervane as a new kind of technology, Noguchi's own machine in the garden, which offered a multi-sensory approach to the American tradition. For Noguchi, the weathervane and all that it symbolized ought not to have been restricted to the past as a nostalgic talisman, but instead needed to be updated and reimagined for the modern world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for this thought-provoking talk. I feel like you've brought in so many different threads, and it was fascinating to see all of the images as well. For everyone on the call, this is the point where we invite you to submit questions. And one of our first questions here asks if Noguchi knew Harry Bertoia and his Sonambiance.
That's a really good question. I imagine that they couldn't not have known each other, but I have not read anything explicitly about their relationship. But that's a great question for future research. Thank you.
One of the things that I was curious about in your talk, it was fascinating to hear about how your thoughts around how these weather vanes don't survive, but do you know if any of Noguchi's contemporaries were also exploring weather vanes, other artists in the 30s, or is this something that's very unique to his practice?
Yeah, I did a little bit of research and I did not find any examples of conception of industrially producing these from an artist. I think Noguchi was really unique in the fact that he occupied simultaneously the role of a sculptor or a quote unquote fine artist, and also was very interested in the production of domestic materials and the use of industrial production. So that might have allowed him to better move into this realm than other artists. But as we saw and illustrated in other talks today, there certainly was an interest in weather vanes as subject matter for many of these modern artists.
Thank you. One of the aspects of your talk that I think was really compelling was when you were talking about Noguchi's interest in weather vanes as being sort of symbolic of American identity, and those preliminary designs, the drawings with the pitched roofs. Do you know if Noguchi ever did tests with weather vanes on buildings? I'm especially wondering about the lunar vanes, thinking about Catherine's talk with parts of the Gowden's weather vane blowing off. So would any of these have been on a building?
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as I know, no. They never made it past this prototype stage where they were made of plaster or timstone, which wouldn't have withstood nature. Actually, timstone is very susceptible to water. So definitely not the right material. But it's a good question of whether he tried them out. And I'd like to think that maybe he did, given that he was so interested in like achieving the sonic qualities. And there was very much an interest in getting it to a point that he had imagined it. Whether it was never realized in production form, I think that he really wanted to perfect these models. And his interest in technology and in collaborating with industrial experts suggests to me that he would have been very invested in the question of whether this weather vane could have functioned as a weather vane in actuality. I was interested earlier in the point about symmetrical weather vanes. While we don't have them in person, we have photographs only. There does seem to be an emphasis on mirroring on both sides. So that suggests perhaps that it's a good first step, I suppose.
I think your talk is doing so much to recover some of this lost material. And one sort of final question that I had was also wondering about if there are any records in the archives of responses to these designs. They seem, it's really, I think I speak for all of us just saying that they're so fascinating, and the design and the organic shapes, they're so distinct from all the weather vanes that we've seen today and from historic examples. So is there anything where other artists or studio assistants or collectors or patrons are writing about these designs?
That's also a fascinating question. There's nothing that I found in the archives through my searches. An outstanding question for me is who actually saw these designs. I mean, as I mentioned, we have the photographs of them in his studio for many years, which suggests that they would have had an audience. But he was not famous yet when he was creating these designs. So I imagine he showed them to his cohort and peers, but the reach of who saw them remains a mystery to me.
Well, thank you. We have one final question, and this asks that since Noguchi also worked with Martha Graham, the famous dancer, He clearly thought expansively about intersections between visual and performing arts. Can you tell us anything about overlapping interests and how they might have inspired one another?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I was thinking of including in this talk his work on Appalachian Spring, which was a Martha Graham dance, because that to me is also very evocative of American tradition and American culture. But I think that his interest in dance is also in keeping with his interest in movement, and that dynamism is something that's common in a lot of his work, but definitely in the Weathervanes and definitely in dance. So I see them as very closely associated. And I just think that, referring to them as musical Weathervanes, there's a certain level of poetry there that you might think of as present in dance as well.
I think poetry and performativity, like the objects themselves, take on, if they were ever I would imagine if they were ever put outside with the elements, they would have taken on a life of their own, animating force. But thank you. This was so wonderful. And we'll transition now to our final speaker of the day. Our final talk of the day, I should say, who is William D. Moore. And Dr. Moore is an associate professor of American material culture at Boston University, where he holds a joint appointment in the Department of History of Art and Architecture and the American and New England Studies program. And he is a longtime friend and collaborator of the Folk Art Museum. He holds a PhD in American Studies from Boston University and his BA in folklore from Harvard. His most recent book, Shaker Fever, America's 20th Century Fascination with a Communitarian Sect, was recently published by the University of Massachusetts Press. And if you haven't read it, it's wonderful. We encourage you to take time to take a deep dive into that. And at this point, I'll turn it over to you, Will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to start by saying what a great pleasure it is to participate today in the American Folk Art Museum's Elizabeth and Irwin Warren Folk Art Symposium. I feel as though I am very fortunate. You might say that I married into the larger extended American Folk Art Museum family about 30 years ago. And since then, both the museum's activities and Liz and Irwin's friendship have shaped my interest in scholarship over the ensuing decades. Thus, it's with great humility, gratitude, and joy that I offer these remarks today. Thank you, Liz and Irwin, for making this event possible and for all that you've done for the field of folk art studies over the years. Now, in this symposium, we're discussing Weathervanes in the context of a museum which has the term folk art in its title. So in the limited time we have today, I want to explore how the concept of folk art contributes to the changing meanings of Weathervanes within American culture. And I was hoping I could move on to my next slide, but having worked, there we go, having worked perfectly during the test run, it was slowing down. So this stereo view produced by the photographer Josiah Freeman on the island of Nantucket in the 1870s provides an apt place to start. In many ways, this image for me exemplifies the spirit of folk art, to steal a phrase from Henry Glassy. The weathered, functional, shingle-covered houses, the elegantly carved figurehead alluding to the island's whaling fleet, the weather vane that portrays a mariner peering through a looking glass, the men seated in wooden chairs wearing antiquated fashions, and finally, the little figure in the foreground sporting a precocious bowler hat while staring down the camera. These details evoke a specific time, place, and group of people who differ from us. While it's hard to make out the details, the weather vane in the stereo review resembles this example in the Eleanor and Mabel Van Alstyne American Folk Art Collection at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Freeman's composition, with its wonderful period details, could easily be compared to a genre painting by William Sidney Mount or a contemporaneous lithograph by Currier and Ives. Freeman's photograph, with its architectural setting and depictions of common material culture, is appealing in the way that it conjures up a rural, pre-modern, pre-industrial America. Of course, the three generations in the photograph also beg to be interpreted as youth, manhood, and age, in resonance with Thomas Cole's Voyage of Life. However, while we revel in this image, redolent of America's maritime heritage, we must be aware that Freeman is creating a particular vision. Freeman was a sophisticated image maker. He created souvenir images like this one to sell to visitors to his island, but he also crafted carte de visite photographs of the island's residents, which portray them as sophisticated and fashionable Victorians, rather than as yeomen participants in an old-fashioned maritime economy. As a photographer then, in creating the stereo view we started with, Freeman was consciously crafting an image that appealed to his patrons and defined the experience of visiting Nantucket. He also produced and sold tourist images of the quaint and obsolete 18th century windmill that figured prominently in the island's skyline, and the 1688 Jethro Coffin House, known locally as the oldest house. Both are maintained today by the Nantucket Historical Association and continue to be anchors of the tourist experience. All of this is to say that the figurehead and the weather vane in this image are not, in the words of Bob Ross, a happy accident. They have been removed from the context for which they were created, on the bow of a ship and the pinnacle of a building, and in the 1870s placed on a grass lawn to be photographed. These objects meant something to the photographer. They were symbols, or to use the semiotic jargon of cultural studies, they were signifiers. The challenge, of course, is to clearly and correctly articulate what the weather vane and the figurehead meant to Josiah Freeman and the patrons to whom he wished to appeal a century and a half ago. Linguists assert that meaning in language is contextually derived. As the world has changed radically since this image was created, we can hardly expect that the meaning of the objects in them have remained stagnant. However, when this image was taken, a decade after the end of the Civil War, as both industrialization and urbanization ramped up to a fever pitch, many New Englanders found a respite from the transformation of their region on the island of Nantucket, which had entered economic stagnation with the end of whaling decades before. The 17th century house, the windmill, the figurehead, and the weather vane all spoke to Freeman's patrons of a preserved outpost of antebellum America. Now, in the title of my talk this afternoon, I have appropriated W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, coined at the end of the 19th century, to describe what the great African-American sociologist called the peculiar sensation of always looking at oneself through the eyes of another. This adaptive use of Du Bois's phrase is appropriate for discussing weather vanes within a program sponsored by a folk art museum, because the existential space between two populations is essential to thinking about the culturally constructed categories of objects collected and shown in such institutions, whether we call it folk art, outsider art, art brut, visionary art, primitive art, or even Holdger Cahill's phrase, the art of the common man. Objects are not considered folk art or outsider art or art brut because of factors inherent in the work of art. Rather, these labels are applied as the result of the gulf that exists between the people who create or manufacture the item and another group who assigns value to it. The folks in the chairs in this picture, the subjects identified with the wooden artworks and the shingled houses, are not the same people who purchased the photograph to take home as a keepsake. This second group, the sophisticates who decide that something is folk art, can and frequently does include collectors, dealers, curators, scholars, and enthusiasts. Of course, the lines between these latter roles are blurred and otherwise indistinct. Frequently, scholarship and museum exhibitions have focused upon the makers, while allowing the second group to go unobserved, unanalyzed, and free of critical scrutiny. These two works by Gerald Naylor and Luis Tapia challenge those of us who work with materials described as folk art to embrace double consciousness and examine both sides of the divide, to be sure that we are aware of ourselves and those who came before us. These works also both make explicit that the relationship between the artists and those who assign value to their cultural productions is inequitable. Tapia's male collector has a significant bankroll protruding from the pocket of his flowered shorts. Folk artists usually have that title applied to them by individuals on the other bank of the cultural divide. Charles Briggs, an anthropologist, has noted that the use of adjectives like naive or primitive, quote, provide a protective semantic shield between producers and consumers of folk art, end quote. The very idea of folk culture, or the existence of a group who could be characterized as the folk, is the result of transformations in European society in the 18th century as part of what sociologists have called the process of modernity. At that time, urban, cosmopolitan, educated elites came to perceive themselves as distinct from the rural agrarian populations who they viewed as existing within a culture that was essentially timeless, unchanging, and linked to locale. Educated, sophisticated linguists and philologists like Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm sought to understand cultural history by collecting stories and songs from marginalized people they perceived as different from themselves, frequently including their servants. Notably, informants were regularly also differentiated from the scholars by gender. Nursemaids and cooks were particularly valued as repositories of romantic pre-modern material. Folktales were referred to as being, quote, told in the kitchen, as opposed to in the drawing room, the study, or the counting house. In a period in which nations sought to define themselves by geography, these scholars codified an understanding of the folk as marginal, geographically rooted, homogeneous, embedded in tradition, and distinct from those who studied them. The very idea of folk art requires both a conception of a population distinct from contemporary genteel society and an embrace of the idea that there are individuals who can transcend their bourgeois cultural surroundings to recognize the beauty and value in the products of that group. This abstract binary, however, does not itself exist outside of time. The boundaries that define who are the folk and who are not between us and them and the other are soft, permeable, conditional, and subject to continual reshaping based upon historical contingencies. As we talk about the meaning of objects then, we have to be cognizant of time. Meanings can slip, signifiers and signified swing according to context. As the cultural and political idea of the folk shifts over time, the same weathervane can connote something different today than it did yesterday and can come to mean something else in the future. Over time, the provenance and ownership history of objects can accrete to alter an object's significance. Tracking individual items through the hands of multiple owners and institutions can provide important insights into how objects are bound into transforming webs of significance. My thinking on this topic has been greatly inspired by Elizabeth Stillinger's scholarship. This rooster weathervane, for example, created in about 1860, first appears in the public record in the collection of William Whiting Nolan of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Nolan, who was born in Philadelphia at about the same time that the rooster was manufactured in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, established a school in Harvard Square, unaffiliated with the university, that both helped applicants gain admission to the university and also aided struggling admitted students to pass their classes. Nolan was a familiar figure for generations of students in Harvard Square who dubbed him the Widow. In 1903, a satirical publication published this caricature of Nolan with a paunch and a brush mustache. Nolan never married and became quite wealthy. When not tutoring the privileged sons of New England's WASP elite, he amassed an extensive collection that at his death in 1923 was auctioned off by the Anderson Galleries in New York City. Nolan's antiquarian collection was mostly American and focused largely on New England. One of the standout items was the baptismal robe of Thomas Hutchinson, the last English governor of Massachusetts. Another, a chair supposedly linked to William Penn that you see here in a publicity photograph from the auction. For Nolan, this rooster weathervane was part of his antiquarian compulsion to collect evidence of the Anglo-American past. Based upon the contours of his collection, we can understand that Nolan was participating in regional filiopietism, in which he saw himself as culturally and geographically linked with the maker of the weathervane, although possibly somewhat distanced in time. When it went on the auction block in 1923, however, the weathervane had its meaning transformed. On that day, this rooster weathervane was acquired by Ellie and Viola Knottleman, who we've heard a little bit about today. The new owners were significantly different from Nolan, the Philadelphia-born, Harvard-educated Cantabrigian bachelor. Knottleman was born in Poland and trained as an artist in Paris before immigrating to the US in 1914. His wife, educated in Europe, was the daughter of an Italian-born countess and a wealthy New Yorker. When they were married in 1919, he was a successful artist functioning within the nascent modernist movement, and she was a comfortably well-off widow. They lived a transatlantic life at their ease on both continents. Like Nolan, the Knottlemans were voracious collectors. They added his weathervane to a large corpus of such works that composed a subcategory of their large holdings of furniture, textiles, ceramics, toys, and other objects. Rather than being interested in region and history, however, the Knottlemans were fascinated by form, pattern, and abstraction. In the materials that they gathered, these two sophisticates saw antecedents for the world of modern art in which they lived. They also functioned in the context of Marcel Duchamp's idea of ready-mades, in which part of artists' creative activities was seeing beauty in the world around them. The second item from the Knottlemans collection, which you see on the right, gloriously expresses an abstraction of the traditional cock weathervane. The Knottlemans were influential, but as we've heard earlier today, did not function alone. They were part of a large American art world that valued both American national identity and a modernist sensibility. This group, as we've heard, included Edith Halpert and the Downtown Gallery and her associates like Holdra Cahill and her stable of artists, including Charles Sheeler, Stuart Davis, and Yasuo Kuniyoshi. All around the globe, partly as the result of the global onset of economic depression, the 1930s was a period of intense nationalism, tragically leading in Europe to both fascism and National Socialism. In the United States, following upon the heels of the Red Scare and the rampant nativism of the 1920s, a left-leaning, ethnically and religiously diverse group of artists attempted to use folk art to construct an alternative, inclusive national identity. Here we see Kuniyoshi's incorporation of a horse weathervane into a modernist still life sold by the Downtown Gallery to a collector in Santa Barbara, California, thus pulling together different regions of the country. Notably, the photograph that Halpert used to sell Kuniyoshi's painting was created by the prolific New York modernist photographer Soichi Tsunami. And again, you can see both the downtown gallery label and the stamp of Tsunami on the back of this photograph. Thus, in this instance, two Japanese American artists, and this again resonates with Noguchi that we just heard about, these Japanese American artists were involved in the creation and distribution of this painting with a weather vane to construct an American identity. And this is, of course, also the same era in which Aaron Copland, born to Lithuanian Jewish parents in Brooklyn, incorporated Shaker music into Appalachian Spring in his ongoing project of creating an American classical music. So this was a sophisticated and New York-centered conflation of folk art, modernism, and nationalism, and it was exported to the national stage through the Index of American Design, which we've talked about a little bit throughout the afternoon. Designer Ruth Reeves and progressive librarian Romana Javits convinced Holdridge Cahill within the New Deal bureaucracy that the country would benefit from a visual encyclopedia of the material culture that defined national identity. This encyclopedia, of course, included weather vanes such as those owned by the Knottlemans. Underemployed artists, including Rawlington Campbell and Herman Bader, were trained and dispatched to create documentary drawings of the stuff of American life. The thousands of drawings created by the Index, now held by the National Gallery, were shown across the country, as we've seen, and subsequently published repeatedly for the rest of the 20th century in books and magazines. And it helped to create, as we've heard, a canon of American folk art in the national consciousness. And the Index of American Design became very much a centerpiece of middlebrow American culture throughout the end of the 20th century. Now, from the very beginning, Reeves and Javits conceived of the Index of American Design as providing inspiration for industrial designers creating consumer goods that would drive the national economy. Early attempts, however, failed because of the ongoing depression and subsequent wartime production restrictions. As the United States economy exploded during the early days of the Cold War, however, artists and designers drew heavily upon the imagery provided to them by the New Deal program. And I would argue that this is really its largest contribution, was the home goods using it in the Cold War period. However, once again, the political and cultural context had shifted. Nationalism and folk art were now tied to Roosevelt's four freedoms, the American way of life, and a kind of a consensus view of history in which American cultural exceptionalism justified the country's expanded new role in the world. And I think part of the kind of multiculturalism and the kind of multi-ethnic vision that the people in the 1930s had envisioned falls away in this period. Now, the relationship between the Index of American Design, anti-communist ideology, and post-war mid-century consumerism has yet to be adequately explored. But weather vanes and other folk art motifs appear regularly in Cold War home goods. Here are two textile patterns created by the commercial artist Laura Jean Allen in 1952 as part of a program called Associated American Artists that sought to elevate consumer taste by blurring the line between artists and designers. Allen, who designed sprightly New Yorker cover illustrations, includes weather vanes in her designs along with clocks, shaker rockers, spinning wheels, and portraits. A rooster weather vane peeks out of the background in Family Album on the right, to the right of a shaker rocker and beneath a portrait of a young girl with brown hair. The role of the Index of American Design is even more evident in Aaron Borod's 1952 country auction, produced in two different color registers. Borod, who was a longtime artist in residence at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, included multiple weather vanes in his design, along with the spinning wheels, decoys, trade signs, and ceramics that were the stock and trade of the index. Our time today will not allow me to pursue the challenging and fun exercise of source finding for each of these elements within the index drawings at the National Gallery, but some of his inspirations are readily recognizable. Now, within the boom years of the post-war economy, department stores created and fulfilled a niche for decorative ladies' handkerchiefs. This market was sufficiently vital that it could support both first string and second string designers. Handkerchiefs by Thomas Keefe, who died in 1960 at the age of 46, were available only at exclusive retailers. Pat Pritchard supplied designs for competitors. Both designers found Weathervanes compelling enough and sufficiently attractive to the market to include them within their oeuvre. Keefe's design on the left, entitled Americana, appears to include the widow Nolan's rooster weathervane in the corners of the handkerchief. In 1875 stereographs and mid-century modern ladies' handkerchiefs, Americans have found weathervanes compelling and capacious symbols. The concept of double consciousness, by focusing on those who collect, document, and promote, as well as those who produce weathervanes, can help us to forge complex understandings of the significance of this form. Contextual clues concerning history, provenance, and ownership allow us to navigate and differentiate how similar weathervanes in different contexts can signify in anti-industrialism, filio-pietism, modernist abstraction, liberal nationalism, and global American exceptionalism. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for this incredible talk that brings us into, you brought us so close to the present with these Cold War concerns and with the changing significance and symbolism of weathervanes. And I think you've really brought together many of the different threads that we've heard today in your talk, which was fascinating. So for everyone on the call, this is the time when we invite questions, and we have just a few minutes left before we hear from Emily. So as you were talking about what the sort of changing symbolism of weathervanes over time, I'm wondering sort of where you see the significance of these objects, the symbolism of these objects now going from the Cold War to the present. I know that this is something that is explored in depth in our current exhibition, but from someone from an outside perspective, I think it's interesting to pose this question to you, having given us this long narrative.
I wonder about this, because what I see is so many of our institutions currently that have made a living selling and interpreting these images. I think of Sturbridge Village or the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Center. So many of them are struggling these days, and I wonder about how much in the present Americans are invested in this kind of Americanist symbolism, whether there is still an interest in it, particularly when so much of it, as we've seen in our conversations of today, so much of it continues to be kind of ethnocentric. And there's so much that is wrapped up in the ugly white supremacist imagery of the past, that how do we continue as scholars to be able to talk about these images without kind of reverberations of the biases and prejudices of the past. So I think that's a real issue of how do we continue to deal with this material, but do it in an analytic rather than a celebratory mode.
You know, I think that's you really get to the heart of the issue. And in thinking about the slides that you shared and those designs from the 50s, you know, I was struck by seeing the sort of ubiquity of the Native American figures. And this is something that Liz mentioned we explored in a program recently that consulting scholar Joseph Zordin, as well as Emily and Bob address in the exhibition. And I think this is the great question. This is, you know, in thinking about all of the avenues for future research, that feels like the most urgent and most important. And I think it's one that, in a way, I'm not sure if there are any other questions after that. That is the great sort of crux of where we are in the field. And you as a professor working with students, with the next generation, you know, what better steward for this work, because I'm sure you're seeing with your students how they're grappling with these questions.
Right, and I've even got a student that is working on scrimshaw and whaling art, and is even decentralizing it to think about what it means to have these art works that are privileging the human over the animal. And what does it mean to be collecting relics that are made of the bones of an animal that has been killed for the American economy? And how do we come to deal with that, particularly in this period of eco-criticism?
Well, I hope that we have an opportunity to meet your student and to engage with them as well. I think, you know, that brings us back to the very beginning of the day with Laura and questions around materiality and preservation and the environment and all of the environmental concerns that we feel most urgently now as climate change ramps up. And, you know, this is a place that I want, I feel like this is a really wonderful place to end, but we did just get a question and I think we should ask it. So this comes to us from an anonymous participant who asks, do you see American nationalism in art as a reaction to German ethnic patriotism? So how, you know, how do you see those as linked?
I would not say it's a reaction to the German national patriotism. Rather, I would say that it has to do with the political and economic dynamics of the Great Depression, right? That in that time, the Great Depression was a period in which, after decades of national boundaries falling and trying to get more and more global trade, as nation after nation had their economy crash, more and more they solved the problem by creating boundaries. And then these economic and political boundaries then had to be justified by returning to a 19th century idea of nationalism, of Germany for Germans, and the France for the French, the same kind of America first rhetoric that we're seeing showing up again internationally in the present. You know, so I think that it's not so much that American identity as being created first through the 1930s and then into the 1940s. I don't think it was so much a reaction against other nations, but more it was a reaction to the economic situation and having to create a reason for why social programs should only be for Americans rather than having open boundaries and being able to provide social programs more broadly. But you have to remember that even in that time, you had voices that were opposing that. So I think particularly about Woody Guthrie, you know, and thinking about this land is your land, this land is my land, which has become in the late 20th century kind of a nationalist anthem. But Woody Guthrie meant it not as nationalist as well at all, but that anybody was welcome. You know, this land is your land, no matter who you are.
Well, I think it's a very inspiring note to land on, to leave this sort of question and answer session, one of inclusion and in continued analysis, and again, a call for further research. So at this point, thank you again, Will, and I'm going to turn it over to Emily Javalt to close the program.
Thank you so much, Persephone. Thank you, Will, for that wonderful, complex discussion. And thank you to all of our speakers for these truly fascinating presentations today, which I personally so much enjoyed. And I'll just be very brief in offering a few closing remarks. I want to emphasize one of the goals that I know was very much on Bob Shaw's mind throughout his work on the American Weathervanes book, and that continued throughout our presentations for the AFAM exhibition, was really to look at this material through multiple interpretive lenses. And in the show, we focused on this through explorations of weathervane craftsmanship, scientific analysis, art history, and social history, emphasizing the really rich layers of storytelling that are revealed by close looking at these special objects. And I'm so delighted to see how today's talks have taken up and furthered this goal in wonderfully expansive ways. I'm so struck to think back about all of the themes that we've touched on today. If you think about it, we've heard, of course, about United States history, but also touched on everything from ancient Rome to early Christianity. We've closely explored a time span ranging from the colonial and revolutionary periods to the Gilded Age and the rise of modernism. And we've looked at individuals ranging from iconic weathervane makers like Shem Drown to many other historical figures, including George and Martha Washington, William Rush, Hiawatha, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Augustus St. Gaudens, Hamilton Easter Field, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, Edith Halpert, Holger Cahill, and Isamu Noguchi. And it's really thanks to the brilliance of all of our speakers that we have learned so much today about such a range of topics. We've also learned so much about the material and technical features of weathervanes, from the political implications of white pine to the challenges of mounting these large and complex objects. And we've heard such a fascinating discussion of a range of social and cultural themes, including patriotism, identity, stereotyping and exclusion, as well as nostalgia, innovation, and change. So what I think we can draw from all of this is the extent to which weathervanes can serve as keys to a really complex, overlapping narrative of American history, broadly speaking, because of their long legacy as part of the rural and urban landscape, and their iconic status as rediscovered works of folk art. These objects provide a unique connecting bridge across time, from early American history to modernism and beyond. And also, as Will was so eloquently arguing in his talk, their analysis requires a certain breakdown of boundaries historically erected between disciplinary categories such as folk art, decorative arts, design, material culture, and academic art history. So it's so wonderful to see all of these themes coming to light and intersecting in fascinating ways today. And I just want to say it's very much thanks to Bob Shaw for creating the project that has given foundation to today's talks. And of course, once again, to Liz and Irwin Warren, whose generosity and passion for American folk art has made today's event possible. Each of our speakers today has opened new windows onto the exploration of weathervanes, and I want to thank them all again for their insights, as well as to thank you as our audience for your enthusiastic interest and participation. If you enjoyed today's program, we encourage you to consider a donation to AFAM, and if you're eager for more on weathervanes, please come and see us at 2 Lincoln Square, where you can see the exhibition and pick up your very own copy of Bob Shaw's important book. And lastly, if you can't make it to the show, or even if you can, there's some wonderful installation footage featured as part of a recent segment on NYC Arts on PBS Channel 13, for which Persephone will be sharing a follow-up link. Thank you again for joining us, and I wish everyone a wonderful Sunday evening. We hope you'll be in touch again soon.